So I need to go back for a moment. I need to talk about, I don't know if it was on Thursday or on Wednesday, but I want to go back to some evidence that was briefly discussed. There was a note, we got to go back to when the defendant was arrested, November 30th of 2001. He was arrested shoplifting at Wegmans in Pennsylvania. This was while he was on the run after he had absconded bail in Galveston. When he was arrested, they found a notebook in his car. Inside that notebook, one of the pages had the following: "What Dee Dee is doing to me puts me in the same place as what Kathy did to me." Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that Dee Dee is Douglas Durst. And the place that Dee Dee is putting him in, the defendant himself, when he is in custody, is going to be talking on the phone approximately, I can't remember if it's a couple of weeks later, in fact. Yeah. So on December 14th, he's going to have a phone conversation. That conversation is going to be with his wife. And during that call, he is going to be discussing how he was feeling about Douglas Durst. And this evidence is being admitted to demonstrate, to connect, that when he said that it was putting him in a place, what Kathy did to me, that place was homicide. And he's going to explain it in his own words.
And do you know what I told you the other day about when we were talking, what I said I thought you were going to do? Remember?
No.
We were talking, you were telling me about what your life has been like and what you were thinking.
Yeah, my plans, yeah.
Okay.
I'm definitely not going to say.
Okay, but you told me what your plans were, well, and I told you that I knew, I had a feeling, I suspected. Remember?
You know, I totally screwed it up, didn't I?
Oh, never mind that, but if I suspected, he too suspected. What I'm trying to say. You didn't really focus on
Well,
it.
something I think I left this out. Did I tell you that I went to his Patona house while I was in Danbury?
I think I read that you did, but I don't remember if you told me.
You read somebody. I mean, I think I told these, you know, the Mike Kennedy types. I was driving around these places. I grew up, my family places. And
Oh, it was in the newspaper then.
yeah, but I really went. And the next time we have a visiting day, I'll go over it with you.
I'd like to hear it, but...
I sort of left that out.
Okay, but I just want you to know that, remember what I told you I thought you were going to do? He knew it too. Keep that in mind.
I think that if he was concerned about that, he wouldn't have been treating me so bad.
I disagree.
What?
I don't agree with you. Treating you
Because he
so
thought
bad.
I would screw it up like I did. Maybe he's right. I guess he is right then.
But, you know,
If
just
you're
remember
right...
that if I knew it, he knew it. That's my point.
Now, the evidence is going to show that Douglas Durst was living in Katona. That's a small town near, actually, South Salem, where Kathy and Bob Durst were living in the lakeside cottage. The evidence is going to further show that this conversation that Mr. Durst was discussing, the fact that he had screwed up his plan to kill Douglas. And in fact, he's going to expand upon that in another call that's going to take place with his wife a little over a week later. He is going to refer to something called Igoring. Evidence is going to be put on this case that refers to the defendant's dogs, Igor. He's had several dogs. I want to make clear, in the movie All Good Things, there were allegations that Mr. Durst had killed his dogs, many of which he named Igor. In fact, the evidence is actually going to show that wasn't true. Evidence is going to show Bob Durst loved his dogs very much. And in fact, when he was watching the Jinx, as you'll remember, and when I spoke to him in New Orleans, what he ended up saying was, he ended up being very clear. He interrupted Mr. Jarecki and said the thing that really bothered him about the movie. He ends up saying, "How could you think I could do something to Igor?" Now, the evidence will show that Mr. Durst never made such responses, never complained about the fact that the movie depicted him as murdering 3 people. Now, in this next clip, he is going to refer again to his brother Douglas, but he's not going to do so by name.
From way back when, I was planning on Igoring BM.
Yes, I know.
So that was a big problem getting married. Because I was afraid that what happened to me just now, would happen back then.
Well, can I ask you now that you brought that up? Don't you think he knew how you felt?
I don't think he knew what Igor.
Yeah, I think he did because I knew. So I think.
Oh no, he don't know me like that. Maybe now he suspects that maybe or something. I don't know. This is just so. I suspect he doesn't even suspect now.
Now remember, at the time that they're having this conversation, it has now been publicly aired that Mr. Durst has been charged with murdering and dismembering Morris Black. So the evidence is going to show that when Mr. Durst says that, quote, he don't know me like that, maybe he does now, what he's referring to is the fact that now his brother Douglas has information, has evidence that in fact he's a killer. Now, a little later in the same conversation, if you picked up on it, he referred to Douglas Durst as BM. The evidence is going to show that BM is again Douglas Durst, and he's going to connect it up in the next call by discussing how he would need this BM to testify, in essence, about their upbringing.
For me to explain or let the jury know what a terrible life I've had, the way to do it is to get BM to testify.
No, it's a bastard.
What?
It's like an incredible mistake.
I care. I could get BM and I could get the other people who watch him being, during those days,
Right.
and have them all testify.
Now, years later, when Mr. Durst was interviewed by Jarecki and Smerling in 2012, during the last interview, he completely denied this entire incident.
I have a dog question, and I think I don't know if this came from Kaiser or the tapes or whatever, but somebody said that when you and Deborah were talking on the phone, that you guys had a code when you were in prison, and that she talked about, or you talked about, Igoring your brother. Well, I was thinking about Igoring him, and then at another time you said something about Sam. I was going to Sam that person and Igor that person. So I just wanted to ask you that. I don't know that it's
something I was going to Igor my brother, or Sammy my brother. I never knew anything about that.
Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that in this case, not only do many of the most damaging pieces of evidence come directly from the defendant, but he doesn't remember what he has said and who he has said it to. Now, this information with his brother Douglas becomes very important. And this is why, and I want to now fast forward to something I was talking about on Thursday. And this is how did law enforcement in Los Angeles become involved in this case. Detective George Shamlian is going to testify in this case. Detective George Shamlian, who's seated right over there, is the lead investigator in this case. He works for the Los Angeles Police Department's robbery and homicide. And when Detective Coulter retired in approximately November of 2012, Detective Shamlian was given the case. On December 19, 2012, Detective Shamlian is going to testify that he met with FBI agents in Los Angeles. One of those FBI agents was an individual named Eric Perry from New York. Detective Shamlian is going to tell you that Eric Perry became involved in this case. You're also likely going to hear from Eric Perry as well. The evidence is going to show that Eric Perry became involved in this case when Douglas Durst, security chief, made a complaint to the FBI because Douglas Durst was afraid that Bob Durst was going to kill him. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is this contact occurred with Detective Shamlian before Detective Shamlian ever knew who Andrew Jarecki was, who Mark Smerling was, anything about All Good Things or the Jinx. Detective Shamlian is going to tell you that he ended up getting this information. He's going to tell you that as the lead investigator on the case, he controls the investigation. He makes the decisions. But he's going to tell you that it is very common, almost routine, that especially on significant cases, detectives from his office will call representatives from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, particularly from our Major Crimes Division, of which Detective Shamlian will tell you I was a member, and to discuss what's going to be done on cases. Now, Detective Shamlian is going to also tell you that before he ever had any contact with me, the first thing he did after being contacted by the FBI was they were interested in exhuming Susan Berman's body for looking for evidence. Could there be DNA under her fingernails? Detective Shamlian is going to tell you that the first thing he did was he contacted the funeral home. And in essence, he's going to tell you he was told, you know what, when we got the body, we thoroughly cleaned under the nails, cleaned the body completely, so that DNA, if there were any, Detective Shamlian is going to tell you, not going to be there. But Detective Shamlian is going to tell you he did other things as well. He next contacted a criminalist at LAPD's SID division. And they're the people that basically test for DNA, etc. He went over the information he'd been given, and he was told by the criminalist from the lab, you know what, yeah, if that's what they've done with the body, you're not going to get any DNA. Now, Detective Shamlian is also going to tell you that he did not speak to me until January 23rd, 2013. This is after he had already received this information, and he's going to tell you again that as a detective, on cases like this, you call the district attorney's office because in the end, although they do the investigation, we're the ones that decide to file the case. Detective Shamlian is going to tell you that he discussed the case with me and that I gave him my advice on what I would recommend. Detective Shamlian is going to tell you that in the end, he's the investigator. He makes decisions, and he made the decision in this case based on all the information he's been told that it did not make sense to exhume Susan's body for DNA because, one, she'd been shot in the back of the head with no signs of a struggle, and two, her body had been processed and cleaned in a manner that you weren't going to get any DNA, and that if you did, it was likely going to be what we call transfer, and an artifact, meaning that it's from people handling the body not related to the crime. So the evidence is also going to show that eventually Detective Shamlian did have contact with Jarecki and Smerling. However, they are not the ones that instituted this case being investigated. That was done by the FBI and by LAPD, Detective Shamlian and other members of the Robbery Homicide Division. So now I'm going to go to where we were. Let me switch this out here. That was great. Hey Tim, can you help me? I closed it. For some reason you can't see it on the computer. I can only see it up there and I closed the wrong file. Sorry about that. Just, if you guys are counting, we started with like 7 of these, and they were full. This is all that's left. And while he is setting that up, I just want to emphasize that because of the way this case is going to be shown with the witnesses, etc., that this is really the only chance that I have to give you guys a clear idea of what you're going to see. And so I want to make sure that for you guys to be able to do your job, that I make sure I do mine. So that's why it's been so lengthy. All right, let's talk about, so we were saying that, back up a couple slides here. So on October 29, 2013, Detective Shamley is going to testify that he went through, he and I went through the evidence, and we found this envelope. And the evidence will further show that this is actually the envelope. You can see November 14, 2000, the postmark. That is the postmark for one of the $25,000 checks that Bob Durst said that he sent to Susan. And we're also going to show you the check that we have back from the bank that corroborates it. I think I actually showed that during the opening previously. But so the envelope, it turned out, was still there. Obviously, as you can see, it was addressed to Susan, and although some of it was in cursive and some of it was in print, what was important is that the 1527 Benedict, at top is the cadaver note, and at the bottom is the October 2013. Well, that's not good. Okay. All right, in 2014, LAPD retained two world-renowned forensic document examiners, Lloyd Cunningham and Linton Muhammad. And they were brought in to compare Durst's handwriting to the cadaver note and envelope. Now, this information was not revealed to Bob Durst. So at this point in time, he has no idea this is going on. He is, the evidence will show, he's not in custody. He's out living his life. So he doesn't know this is happening. Now, Lloyd Cunningham and Linton Muhammad concluded that Bob Durst wrote the cadaver note. So they came back and said there are different opinions they can give, which Detective Shamling will discuss. The highest rating they can give is that it is their opinion that this was in fact written by the individual, and that person was Bob Durst. So on October 15, 2014, Jarecki emailed Durst and his lawyer, Steve Rabinowitz, informing them that the documentary had been sold and would be airing on HBO. So this is the first time that Bob Durst is now notified through his attorney, and he's copied on this as well, that you know what, there's going to be not only a show based on the video, but that it's going to be on HBO. On February 8, 2015, the first episode of the 6-part documentary series, The Jinx, premiered on HBO. And let me emphasize again, The Jinx itself was heavily edited. You will not be seeing anything from The Jinx. You will only be seeing the interviews that were originally the source, which were then edited and put into The Jinx. But in any event, this premieres on February 8, 2015. The evidence will show that this was a major event and generated an incredible amount of publicity. That becomes important because the defendant knows what's going on, and he knows what's going to happen later on, or has a good idea in The Jinx, because he's aware of the confrontation from April 18, 2012. Now, the episodes aired every Sunday night, the conclusion on March 15, 2015. What's important is that it wasn't until the 5th episode, which aired on March 8th, the evidence will show, that the defendant became aware that Sarah Kaufman had been cooperating with the producers. Now, on March 8, 2015, that episode airs. Got ahead of myself here. Durst watched the episode live from his residence in Texas. Now, how do we know that? Because Sarah Kaufman is going to testify that immediately upon the conclusion of that episode, Bob Durst calls him freaked out and in a panic. Sarah's going to testify that Durst was furious that Sarah had given the filmmakers and not him, Durst, the letter. Now, at the time, Durst was living at the Robin Hood luxury condominium complex in Houston. On March 10, 2015, 2 days after the episode aired, this is surveillance video of Bob Durst leaving the condominium at 12:40 p.m. He was never to return. On March 11, 2015, again, the next day, detectives, not the district attorney's office, detectives from LAPD obtained an arrest warrant from a Superior Court judge, meaning that they had probable cause to arrest him for Susan Berman's murder. Investigators then traveled to Houston, and these are RHD detectives, LAPD detectives, a group of them. They traveled to Houston, and they went there with the intent to arrest Bob Durst and take him into custody. At this point, there is no case that has been filed against Mr. Durst by the district attorney's office. There's an arrest warrant, which LAPD got on their own, but the district attorney's office has not filed a case. Now, by the time detectives arrive, remember, we're giving you the information right now kind of in hindsight. So you know information the detectives didn't know at the time. So you know, because you've just seen it, that Bob Durst is going to flee the Robin Hood apartment. But detectives don't know that. They'll find out all this later during their investigation. And by the time they get there, he's already fled the city. On March 14, 2015, with the aid of the FBI, investigators determined that Durst was making phone calls from a payphone at the JW Marriott in New Orleans. Now, the evidence is going to show that in an unusual kind of result of this case, Bob Durst is going to do the same thing and make the same mistake that he did at the phone booth in Garbersville when he was driving down to murder Susan. Even though he's not going to be using his cell phone, he's going to call his voicemail to check for messages. That's how they ended up connecting with the phone booth in Garbersville, and the FBI ends up connecting him and learning that he is at that payphone at the Marriott in New Orleans. 2 FBI agents, William Williams, it should have been, we left the S off, who goes by Chuck, and Crystal Bender quickly respond to the JW Marriott. At the time, Special Agent Williams is going to tell you he had his, I think it was a Ford F-150 truck in about 300 pieces. He wasn't planning on working that day. He quickly grabs on, gets on a suit, and he and Crystal Bender head down there. There are only 2 of them, and you're going to hear evidence that the JW Marriott is a very large hotel in New Orleans. So when they arrive, they actually see in the lobby of the hotel, there's a person they believe is Bob Durst. So they approach him. Special Agent Williams will testify that he repeatedly called out Mr. Durst, but the individual, who will later be identified as Bob Durst, would not respond, would not acknowledge his name. FBI agents identify themselves, and they detain Durst in the lobby. They are detaining him pursuant to that arrest warrant from Los Angeles. They're not arresting him for anything that they're investigating. They're, in essence, responding to this warrant and taking him into custody. Now, Durst eventually tells the agents that he checked into the hotel under the name Everett Ward. Now, Everett Ward, the evidence is going to show, is actually a name of a person going way back to Galveston who had purchased a bandsaw from Chalmers, a bow saw, from Chalmers. He was completely uninvolved in the case. He was just another person who had purchased a saw, but his report had been given in discovery. And the evidence will show that Bob Durst gets names, he gets addresses, he gets social security numbers, and he uses them. So he was using Everett Ward from an incident that occurred 14 years prior. Now, investigators would ultimately identify and search the hotel room at the Marriott where Durst was staying. Inside the room, they would find the following: a falsified text identification card with Durst's photo, but with the name Everett Ward. So the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst had a phony ID made using his picture and information about Everett Ward. They also found his true passport. They found a map of Florida and Cuba. They found $44,631 in cash. They found this expensive lifelike latex mask. So this is a mask that literally goes over and allows you, they're not cheap, it allows you to basically become somebody else. And finally, they found a loaded .38 caliber revolver. Now the next day, on Sunday, March 15th, myself and detectives interviewed Bob Durst. That's the March 15th, 2015 interview. Now just for you to know, and the evidence is going to show, Mr. Durst was not forced to have that interview. He could have said, I don't want to talk. I'm not interested in speaking with you. But he agreed to the interview, and the evidence is going to show that he made some very damaging admissions. Now, before starting the interview, Mr. Durst was given blanket, coffee, and advice of his Miranda rights. You're going to hear that entire interview with the exception of some edits that the court has made. What that interview is going to show is that the tone of that interview was non-confrontational, it was conversational, and that in fact, it was so conversational that Mr. Durst forgot who he was talking to and why he was there. And he ended up making damaging admissions. Now, it's also going to be clear that Mr. Durst could have ended this interview at any time. He has the right, as everybody says, to say, you know what, I don't want to talk anymore. But he didn't. Instead, he was interviewed for nearly 3 hours. And during that interview, the evidence will show that Bob Durst essentially made what the evidence will show was a confession to Susan's murder.
Do you want me to tell you a little about what I do and who I am?
Whatever you want to talk to me about. It's more pleasant in here than out there.
So, Bob Durst is very clear why he did the interview. He says, you know what? It's more pleasant in here than out there. The evidence is going to show in this case that repeatedly Mr. Durst is going to make decisions that were not necessarily smart. However, the evidence will also show that those decisions were his decisions to make and that he voluntarily made them.
And what really kind of caught me was that most people, when they're talking to anybody, I mean police, family, etc., most people are very much concerned with what other people think of them. And so what will happen is that they'll kind of make themselves out to be nicer, better, etc. And I noticed that with about 90% of the things you're asked, you are brutally honest. I mean, more honest than most people that I've seen, for 90%. But I'm wondering, is that something you're aware of about yourself in comparison to other people, or no? I mean, is that something, am I pointing out something that you've ever thought about or was aware of, or no?
More or less, it's something you're aware of.
Now, during the interview, he was confronted with the fact that despite his typical willingness to talk, that he seemed very reluctant in any interviews that he had previously done to talk about Susan. He would talk about Morris, he would talk about Kathy, but he would not talk about Susan.
Because I noticed it was very funny, interesting. When all the interviews of Mark and Andrew, there was one person that you seemed the least comfortable talking about. Do you know who that was?
Susan, Kathy.
Susan.
Susan, oh, yeah.
You would talk about Kathy, you would talk about Morris, but you didn't want to talk about Kathy. And I was concerned that if you found out that I was looking at this case,
Yeah, I would have backed off, gone to Cuba, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Who knows what?
So Mr. Durst, during that conversation, honestly tells me, yeah, if I would have known you were looking at this case, I would have been in Cuba. By the way, you saw the map that he had. Evidence is going to demonstrate that Bob Durst was on his way out of the country when he was arrested. Now, the subject of Susan's murder continued during this interview with the defendant.
I'm gonna lay my cards on the table. I'm here talking to you today because I truly believe, Bob, I don't think you feel that badly about Morris. That's my view. I don't think you feel badly about Morris. I don't know how you feel about Kathy, but here's what I do know. I know that when you killed Susan, that was not something you wanted to do. Do you know how I know that? I mean, are you interested in why I know that?
I'm going to stay away from killing Susan.
The Mr. Durst's answer is not, I didn't kill Susan. Why are you accusing me of that? His answer was, I'm going to stay away from killing Susan, which the evidence is going to show is not a denial, it's an admission. Now, Durst admitted during the conversation that the only evidence that Kathy ever got on the train was his statement.
But you would agree that the only evidence of her getting on the train is you, right?
Right.
He also, during the interview, made a couple of shocking admissions.
I want to, I'm going to just ask this straight out. If you had killed Kathy, would you tell me?
No.
So Mr. Durst was honest enough to when asked, hey, listen, if you killed Kathy, would you tell me? He says, no. He was asked a related question.
If you had killed Susan, would you tell me?
No.
Now, during the interview, he discussed the thing that really bothered him about All Good Things. And again, it's not going to end up being the allegation that he's responsible for the murder of 3 people.
All Good Things, you agree, presents you as somebody who's responsible for 3 murders, right?
Right.
Plus something else that really bothered you. What was the thing that bothered you most about All Good Things? And you said it to Andrew.
I'm killing all the dogs.
Now, the evidence is going to show that if somebody is accused of murdering 3 people and a dog, and their response is to focus only on the fact that they're upset about the killing of the dog, that the reasonable inference, what the evidence is going to show, is that that means the allegations of the murders are true. Now, the interview went on to discuss Durst's love of dogs.
Okay, so, but by the way, are you a dog person, right?
Yes.
I have a dog. I'm very much into my dog. If you go into my, you know, it's very funny. Well, it's not funny, but believe it or not, in me working on this case, you know, I have young kids, and my daughter was afraid. She said, "Hey, is he going to hurt us?" I said, "No, he's not going to hurt you." And then she said, "Is there any way that he's going to hurt our dog?" And I said, "You know what? There's one thing about Bob that I'm very confident of. Bob loves dogs. Bob would never hurt a dog."
Well, you're right. I appreciate it.
You are dogs, I think, much more than people. Is that right?
Yes.
Now again, the evidence will show that this was another opportunity for Bob Durst to say, listen, I didn't kill anybody. How can you accuse me of murder? I didn't do it. It's not what happened. Now during the interview, Durst was presented with the idea that he doesn't kill because he enjoys killing. And let me back up for a second. There's media out there saying all kinds of crazy things. What the evidence can show in this case is that although the murders that Bob Durst committed are horrible, they're not crazy, and they're not the signs of a deranged individual. What the evidence will show is that Bob Durst killed Kathy Durst in the midst of a nasty divorce. That he killed Susan Berman because he was afraid that Susan Berman was going to reveal what he knew. Now the evidence will show that's not crazy. In fact, it was absolutely accurate. But what the evidence will also show is that Bob Durst killed her about 20 years too late because unbeknownst to him, she had already told her story to the numerous individuals that we've already presented. Morris Black and living in Galveston as a woman, again, this is not some crazy guy. This is somebody who's hiding, who thinks he's about to be charged, and Morris Black knew who he was able to connect him to his name and to New York. They were having issues and arguing about where Morris was going to live, and in the end, Bob Durst eliminated a problem. Cruel, illegal, immoral, homicidal, but not crazy. And again, when he was presented with this idea that he doesn't kill because he enjoys killing, he did not deny the allegation.
I told my daughter, listen, Bob is somebody who, Bob doesn't kill because he enjoys killing.
That's what Cody Gonzalez says. And if you back him into a corner, he'll kill you.
So Bob Durst, on his own, is repeating what a detective from Texas said about him. So you heard the statement. I'm explaining, Bob, you're not somebody who kills because you enjoy killing. And he tells you, you back me into a corner and I'll kill you. That's essentially what he is saying. He's repeating what Detective Casler says, but he's not saying that's wrong. He's not saying that's inaccurate. He's the one bringing it up. Now, Durst was again confronted with the idea that whoever wrote the cadaver note, whoever that person was involved in Susan's murder. Now remember, and this is very important, at the time this is happening, Mr. Durst has not admitted that he wrote the cadaver note.
First of all, you agree, as you sit here today, you agree that whoever wrote that letter, they killed Susan. Agreed?
You see, I don't know that. I mean, maybe there were two people who killed Susan. It doesn't have to be one person. There could be two people. One person could go into the house to shoot Susan, and the other person could be the driver.
Okay, no, let me, just what I mean. Whether the person was the shooter or the driver, whoever wrote the note was a part of killing her.
Yes.
You agree, right?
Yes.
No question, right?
Whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death.
Now, as you listen, what the evidence can demonstrate is that was not kind of a casual response that Mr. Durst didn't know what was being stated. He reiterated, absolutely, and clarified, whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death. Now, at this point in the interview, Durst was asked, hey, how are you being treated?
From what you can tell, does it seem like I've been pretty honest with you and pretty fair?
I don't know if we heard his response. I think he might have cut off. His response was yes, which you will hear this whole interview.
Hey, by the way, Bob, have you better talking to us, right, than being out there? You have in mind having this conversation with us?
I haven't mind you. Excuse me at all.
Have you caught me any lies today during our conversation? Have you seen any lies that I've said to you about anything?
No, I'm not aware of any.
Now, what the evidence is going to show is that Bob Durst's favorite subject in the world is Bob Durst. And that anybody who knows a lot about Bob Durst, he wants to talk to. So the evidence will clearly demonstrate that when the detectives and you're going to hear from the detectives, they're going to tell you that we didn't fly out there to engage Bob Durst in casual conversation. We went out there to interview him and to see what he was going to tell us. But the evidence is going to show beyond any debate, beyond any dispute, that Mr. Durst, as is his pattern, as it was with Andrew Jarecki in 2010, in 2012, over the phone, and with myself and detectives in New Orleans, Bob Durst likes to talk. He likes to talk about Bob Durst, and when he does, he makes mistakes. Now, at the end of the interview, Durst, in essence, confessed to Kathy and Susan's murders by admitting that he had details that he had not yet provided. So as you're listening, what the evidence will show is that Mr. Durst is being pressed to tell the truth, to say what he knows. Mr. Durst's response is not going to be, how can I tell you anything? I don't know anything. I'm not involved in this. That's not what he's going to say. He's going to give an answer that only somebody who is responsible, who knows what happened, would respond that way.
I would like to talk to you when you come back in court today. That's going to be up to you what you do. I don't know whether there'll be a lawyer there today. I don't know what that lawyer is going to tell you.
He's going to tell me to shut my mouth, of course.
And this one I'll tell you. You have every right to listen to your lawyer and to do what your lawyer says. I think you know that you've already told me, you've talked enough. I have enough now. What I want to talk about when we get back is I want to find out what is it that we can discuss where I can get the truth about some of the things that you said you couldn't really answer for me. But you have told me, correct, that there is, you know what I want, correct?
Yes, you'd like some details from me if I knew about where Kathy's body is.
And about what happened to Susan.
And about what happened to Susan.
And you would agree that you're in the position, if you want, to tell me more than you have.
So about that, I'm not about to go that far.
Okay. But wait a minute, because you're telling me, though, that I want to understand when you're saying, tell me what...
Well, you asked me what I thought you wanted to hear. I think what you wanted to hear to make Ann McCormick happy is, what did you do with Kathy?
Right.
And I think you want me to go through details of Susan.
I do.
Okay, so now, what would I ask for?
Tell me.
If I tell you those things, I'm pleading guilty.
Okay.
And I'm pleading guilty. I'm going to be going back to Los Angeles, to California, and doing my time.
Now that exchange, the evidence will show, is crucially important because Bob Durst was admitting that he had the answers to those questions. Answers he could only have if, in fact, he was the killer. Now, the next day, on March 16, 2015, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed special circumstance murder charges against Bob Durst. Judge Wyndham previously read to you the complaint. The only difference, you see a complaint here? A complaint is what is filed when someone is arrested. After they have a preliminary hearing, they are rearranged with what's called an information. In this case, the information and the complaint are either identical or essentially identical. Now, with Durst in custody and unable to flee, the investigation continued. Now, Detective Shamley is going to tell you that between January 2013 and March of 2015, he faced a real dilemma. Because on the one hand, he wanted to go out and he wanted to interview as many witnesses relating to Kathy, Susan, and Morris as he could. But he's also going to tell you that he knew that Bob Durst was out of custody, is out loose with millions and millions of dollars. And that if Bob Durst hears that in fact he is reinvestigating this case, Bob Durst is likely to flee the country, to go to Cuba, the very thing Bob Durst discussed in the interview. So, with that in mind, Detective Shamley is going to tell you that prior to Mr. Durst's arrest, he had to be very careful in terms of who was contacted. And Detective Shamley is going to tell you, and you're going to see it and you're going to hear it, that Mr. Bailey and I had significant involvement in this investigation. Because we were the prosecutors on this case, if the case got filed. We participated, Detective Shamley's going to tell you, in these interviews. Oftentimes, the voice you're going to hear most are going to be Deputy District Attorney Bailey or myself. And Detective Shamley is going to tell you, and you're not going to hear from one other person otherwise, that there is nothing improper or illegal or unethical about that. Now, so with Durst in custody and unable to flee, the investigation continued. And at this point in time, there was somebody that Detective Shamley had wanted to speak to. At the top of the list was Nick Chabin, who was Durst's extremely close friend, and also extremely close to Susan. Your Honor, this is a good place to stop if the court wants.
All right. I'll take your stuff.
About the point of the investigation, now Mr. Durst is in custody. And now detectives are free to go out and to interview people that they could not risk before. Detective Shamley is going to tell you that Nick Chabin was somebody that he wanted to talk to, but Nick Chabin was very close to Bob Durst. Detective Shamley is going to tell you that if you contact somebody who's very close to your suspect, and your suspect is not in custody, and that person talks to your suspect might be gone. So Detective Shamley is going to tell you that now that Bob Durst was in custody, this is the guy at the top of the list that he wanted to speak to. So on April 6, 2015, so this is about 3 weeks after Mr. Durst has been arrested, the evidence will show that multiple attempts were made after Mr. Durst's arrest to contact Nick Chabin, and the Nick Chabin did not want to talk. And you're going to hear from Nick Chabin. He's going to tell you that, you know what, he was avoiding having contact because Bob Durst was his good friend. So he finally returns investigators and prosecutors' calls. And from the start of the conversation, the evidence is going to show that Nick Chabin was reluctant to provide any damaging information against his close friend.
Okay, so tell me, so what is your memory about what Susan said about Bob having killed Kathy?
This is hard for me to say. Can I think about it if I want to talk about that?
So Mr. Chabin made clear that this is something he wanted to think about. He also made clear during that call, and this is again on April 6, 2015, that he was very conflicted with respect to his loyalties.
Hey, Nick, can you tell me, is it because of your loyalty to Bob?
It's understandable, to be honest about it. We're just trying to figure out.
I mean, is
it because you guys are still friends, or? I love Susan. She's a dear, dear friend, and same with Bob. So this thing with your best friend killing your other best friend.
Now, Chabin was specifically asked about Susan's comments about having provided Bob Durst with an alibi for Kathy.
Nick, you also mentioned that Susan said to you that Bob had confided in her to more easily set up an alibi. Do you remember telling the police that?
No.
Do you...
Say that again.
So, yes.
15 years ago, 14 years ago.
But we're not saying whether this is necessarily true or not. We're trying to figure out what Susan told you, that somehow she helped Bob with an alibi and
Oh, yeah.
what did you say about that?
Tell us what you meant by that.
And again, it's not that you're saying you believe this to be true. Just what did Susan tell you about it?
It's hard to remember. You know, I tell you, it's my mind. If I sit down and think about it, I can put myself back and remember it. I don't know if I do it. There was something that she said like that. What did they say after?
Now, the evidence is going to show that it's not that Nick Chavin didn't remember during that conversation exactly what he knew. He just wasn't ready to say it yet. Now, Chavin was asked during that conversation if Durst had ever confessed to him that he had killed Susan. Would he tell us? So if Bob Durst had told you, I killed Susan, would you tell us? This is what he said.
So when I asked you, hey, listen, has Bob ever admitted that he killed Kathy, you had a long pause, and then you said, that's something I don't want to answer. I know you said you didn't want to answer it, but you agree you didn't say no, correct?
I agree to that.
You know what? We lost a slide. Let me see. We go back. Oh, yeah.
Tim, since you did not lose a slide.
What's that?
You did not lose a slide.
So when I asked you, hey, listen, has Bob ever admitted that he killed Kathy, you had a long pause. If I were to say to you, hey, did Bob ever admit to you that he killed Susan? And your answer is, I don't want to answer that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Looks like operator error on my part. Chavin was then asked some, we'll see what this is going to be because I'm not sure. I think I have my slides mixed up, so I'm going to just play it and we'll see what we got.
Have you ever asked him, hey Bob, did you kill Kathy? Or is that another one of those ones you don't want to answer?
That's one of those I don't want to answer.
I know this is tough, but I want you to think about this for a second. Forgetting about Bob for a second, Susan was your close friend, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Forgetting about Bob for a minute, do you want the person who's responsible for her death, do you want that person held accountable? Forgetting about Bob for a second, just whoever that person is, do you want that person held accountable?
Well, you remember what Susan told me about Bob, which was, there's nothing we can do for her now. She's gone, but he's not.
And so is what the way I'm taking that, Nick, is you're kind of the same thing that Susan said about Kathy. You're now kind of saying to yourself about Susan, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's alive. She's not.
So it's a little bit hard to hear. What the evidence is going to show, Nick Chavin said is that in essence, he didn't want to say, and he cited back to what Susan had told him about Kathy, which is, Kathy's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob. Nick Chavin's now saying, Susan's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob. During the call, despite repeated pleadings to please say what you know, Nick Chavin made clear that he just wasn't ready to say what he knew yet.
that's part of the change that's happened with me. I do want the person accountable, and that's what's happened. That's changed to me.
You can do that by just telling us the truth.
I know. And I intended the problem not in this phone.
Now, near the end of the call, the following exchange occurred.
I know when you get off this call, you're going to probably say to yourself, what have I done?
That's exactly
What have I said? And I can tell you that you've said a lot.
So my intention is to duck you as long as I possibly could. But I was so far under the radar, it wouldn't happen.
So what Nick Chabon was saying is that he acknowledged that he understood that he had said a whole lot, and he said that he had ducked us as long as he could, and that he thought he was so under the radar that he wouldn't end up having to talk to us. Now, the evidence is going to show that although Chabon would not reveal the extent of what he knew, he did not deny that he had important information that he just wasn't ready to share yet.
Now, if you choose to talk to us, then we can come out there and we can sit down and talk to you, but just tell us this, without going into all the details. I mean, we pretty much know it. You pretty much said it. You just have skirted around it. Bob pretty much told you recently after he was arrested that he killed Susan, right?
You know, I'm not saying anything, but I think you know the answer to that.
And his response is he's not going to be able to answer it, but he did not deny it. He was again asked, and he refused to say that if Bob had confessed to killing Susan to him, that he would tell us.
If Bob had confessed to you, if Bob had said, listen, I killed Susan, would you tell us right now?
Oh, I didn't want it right now.
Yeah.
So, wait. So the answer for right now, at least during this phone call, is no, you would not tell us. Is that correct?
Well, I think he's telling us he has told us, and we know the answer. He just doesn't want to use the words. Is that right?
Both of you guys are kind of right. I just want a little more time to think about it.
Can I just ask you this? Even though...
It's already out of the bag.
So Nick Chabon made clear when Mr. Balian said on the phone call, well, he has told us. Nick Chabon said, you know, both of you were right, that he didn't want to tell us, but that he actually already had. Now, Nick Chabon was very clear in this call that he was having a lot of problem and a lot of difficulty trying to balance his loyalties to his two best friends.
It's very clear with what you're saying. It's very clear that you're carrying a big weight right now, and you're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. Am I being a disloyal friend?
That's exactly right. Yeah, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, am I being a disloyal friend? You know, I can't bring Kathy back. I can't bring Susan back. But I will tell you that what's right is right. And I think you know I don't have to tell you what's right and what's wrong. Bob has said things to you, and I think you know what the right thing to do is right now. And if you can just get yourself over the hurdle, you know, it's almost like ripping a Band-Aid off, Nick. Just...
Let me tell you, real sad. Everything you're saying is just reaches right into me, and to me, that's exactly what I feel.
So he responded to the comment about how hard it was and that it was like ripping a Band-Aid off by saying that's exactly how he feels. Evidence is going to show that during this conversation, he would not say what he knew, but he did say that he would do so on another day.
I mean, Nick, in the end, we are all responsible in life for the choices that we make. You can't be responsible for what Bob has done, but you can be responsible for covering up for him. And, you know, it's time.
I haven't had to do it.
No, you haven't, because no one has. So I can tell, Nick, it's very funny. You've been kind of waiting for this call from us and trying to figure out what you were going to say and how you're going to handle it. Am I right?
You're right, 100%.
Okay, well, sorry. So listen, so here you are. This is kind of the moment of truth. Just let it out, Nick. Tell us what Bob said. Just get it out.
I'm gonna start ripping off the Band-Aid for another day or so. I promise you I'll talk to you.
Okay, hey, listen, are you giving me...
Give my word.
The last thing I'm going to...
So he said in the end, you know what, I'm not ready to rip the Band-Aid off yet, but I'll talk to you another day. So the evidence is going to show that Nick Chabon was called the next day, April 7th, 2015. And this is how this conversation started.
If we call you tomorrow, you'll tell us the whole thing?
No, I'll talk to you and tell you what I've decided I can say.
Okay. All right, hey, listen.
But I wouldn't be saying that. I mean, I just want to think some more.
Got one slide ahead. So that was the last thing. So it ended with, we'll call you tomorrow. And he'll tell us what he's going to tell us. And this is what happened.
When you get off the phone, the first thing you'll be saying to yourself is, oh my God, what did I say?
What did I do?
Why did I tell him that? And have I told him too much, etc.? You've already told us 90% of it. So
right.
The Band-Aid's almost all off. So we'll call...
Why I told you I knew that if I told you this much, that I couldn't back away.
Hey, Nick, it is very clear to me there are certain people that don't want to give you information. There are other people that you just have to figure out a way to let them give you the information they want to give you. You want to tell us this, it's clear.
Right.
So,
your message was just call me the message that I don't want to talk to you if I didn't want to.
Yeah, so you could have done that.
I didn't do that.
No, you didn't.
So this was the end of that call, and Nick Chabon related that he had been left a message saying, listen, if you don't want to talk to us, just return the call. Because the evidence is going to show he had not returned any calls. Detectives, investigators, prosecutors trying to get a hold of him, and he won't return a call. So he confirmed, as you just heard, that he was told, hey, if you don't want to talk, call us and let us know you don't want to talk. But as he said, he didn't do that. He called and he talked. Following day, April 7th, he was called again.
When we talked yesterday, you said that you and Bob had conversations, and when I asked you, did Bob tell you that he killed Susan and that he killed Kathy, you said that was a question you didn't want to answer.
Right. Well, it was the subject was only Susan, not Kathy.
And this is when Nick Chabon began to mention a dinner that he and Bob had had in Harlem.
It's an open interpretation, okay? We had dinner in Harlem, and during the dinner, he mentioned that one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to tell me, he said, I wanted to talk to you about Kathy and Susan. He said both names in, but then we had dinner, we had a few drinks, and all of a sudden it was time to leave, and we left, we walked outside, and I looked, he was going to go one way, I was going to go the other, and I looked at him and I said, Bob, you were going to tell me about Susan. And he turned me, he just sort of shrugged and looked real, he looked upset and he just shrugged and he kind of mumbled something. I've been trying to put together what it was, and I can't really put together what it was, but he had a resigned look on his face. Then he walked away, and I said, Bob, and he didn't turn back around. He just sort of walked, he looks like a very old man now, and he walked off, and that was that. I just took him not denying it as meaning something. And then the subject of Kathy didn't come up, it was just Susan. The irony is we were supposed to have dinner again, but then all this stuff happened with him going to New Orleans.
Now the evidence is going to show that when Nick Chabon eventually says what happened, it's everything he just said, except for on April 7th, he wasn't ready to say what Bob had told him. You're going to hear from him. He's going to testify, and he's going to tell you that he knew from the very first call. He knew on April 6th what Bob Durst told him, but that it was just so hard. That was his close friend, and that Nick Chavin's going to tell you that a part of it was that he himself did not want to believe and did not want to accept that his best friend could have murdered their other best friend. He was in denial, he's going to tell you. And he wasn't ready to kind of face the facts. And the evidence is going to show that over the next several months, prosecutors and investigators contacted Chavin numerous times. And that those calls, Nick Chavin continued to resist, fully explaining what he knew. He remained resistant. By July 23rd, Chavin was actually attempting, you'll hear, to take back some of the information he had provided.
You also had told us during the first conversation, you had dinner with Bob, and the words that you had used was, you had said that when I asked if Bob confessed, you said he didn't have to. Do you remember telling us that?
No. What?
Okay, so...
I don't even know what it means.
So...
I don't even know what she's told you that I said to her.
So that was Nick Chavin on July 23rd. After a series of additional phone calls, on October 15, 2015, there was another call during which the following exchanges occurred.
Let's rip the Band-Aid off. Start with us. Go ahead. Tell us what happened.
Well, I don't want to do that in this conversation. I got people sitting outside my office now. This is not good. I need to...
Okay. So when can we have this conversation?
I'll call you just like I did now. I mean, I've given this a lot of thought, and it's weird. The only thing that's weird to me is how you seem to know what was going on inside my mind. But I guess you've done this a lot.
My impression of you is not, your problem isn't you can't remember what Bob told you. Your problem is you're having a hard time forgetting it.
Yeah, pretty good.
Stuart and Emily Altman are two of Bob Durst's oldest and closest friends. Stuart and Durst, that is Bob Durst in the middle, that's Stuart to the right, that's Emily to the left. Stuart attended high school with Bob Durst in Scarsdale, New York. They graduated together many years ago. Stuart is also an experienced criminal defense attorney in New York. Emily Altman was called to testify at a conditional examination in this case. There's going to be a stipulation regarding her testimony, so you're not going to see Emily again live, but you're going to hear her conditional examination. Now, Emily reluctantly testified after unsuccessfully challenging her subpoena in both New York and California courts. She did not want to testify. Throughout her testimony, Emily was accompanied in this very courtroom by two of her own attorneys. Those attorneys were paid for by Bob Durst. Now, Emily made clear during her testimony that Bob Durst was her close friend. She admitted that he was godfather to her son. During her testimony, Emily repeatedly claimed a lack of memory, which presented with the most simple of questions. And you're going to listen to her testimony. And the evidence is going to show that she's up on the stand trying to protect her friend. Now, on July 26, 2017, during Emily's second day of testimony, the prosecution initiated a line of questioning, inquiring whether Durst had ever told her where he had been at the time of Susan's murder. Now, at this time, July 26, 2017, the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst had always steadfastly denied that he was anywhere near Los Angeles at the time of Susan's murder. He had, at this point in time, steadfastly denied that he had been at Susan's house. He had steadfastly denied that he had written the cadaver note. And all of a sudden, during the second day of testimony, this is what happened. Emily initially answered that Durst had told her he was in California, but she claimed repeatedly not to have any specific information. After much resistance, the following exchange occurred, which revealed shocking information.
Did Bob Durst ever tell you, in the course of your relationship as friends, that he was in Los Angeles at the time of Susan Berman's murder?
I think he said he was in Los Angeles, excuse me, at some time, but I don't remember specifically saying he was there when Susie Berman was murdered.
When you say he said he was in Los Angeles at some time, you don't mean just generally he's visiting Los Angeles. You mean that he told you, your understanding was that he was in Los Angeles at the time that Susan Berman was murdered. Isn't that correct?
He said he was in Los Angeles.
At the time Susan Berman was murdered, correct?
He didn't say that, no.
What?
He said he was in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles, in terms of what conversation? Strike that. When he's saying he's in Los Angeles, you're talking about at the time Susan Berman was murdered, correct?
In December.
So he said he was in Los Angeles in December of 2000, correct?
Yeah.
Did you ask him specifically what dates in December of 2000 he was in Los Angeles? Ma'am, are you aware, as you sit here today, that Mr. Durst has never admitted to investigators or to the media that he was in Los Angeles in December of 2000? Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not.
Did he mention a hotel or what he was doing here?
I think he mentioned Beverly Hilton. I know there's a hotel.
So he told you that he was staying at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles at the time Susan Berman was murdered. Is that correct?
Yes.
Ma'am, at that time, did you think that was important information that the police might need to know?
No.
At any point in time in the last 17 years almost, has it ever occurred to you that, you know what, that might be important information that the authorities should know about? Now, isn't it true that you chose your friendship with that man? You chose your friendship over justice for Susan Berman.
No.
Now, multiple subsequent questions were premised, and you're going to hear all this, on the fact that Durst had told Emily that he was at the Beverly Hilton around the time of Susan's murder. So the evidence is going to show that she was repeatedly asked when he told you he was at the Beverly Hilton in December of 2000, and then the question. And for the duration of her testimony that day, she never denied nor expressed any doubt that it was Durst himself who had told her that information. The next day, July 27, Emily returned to court for more testimony. During her cross-examination by Mr. DeGarrett, and for the first time, Emily suddenly provided an alternative explanation for Durst's admission. In response to a leading question, Emily stated that the source of her statement that Durst was in Los Angeles at the Beverly Hilton might not have been Robert Durst. So she got up there and said, you know what, maybe I didn't hear it from Bob. Instead, Emily now said the information might have been provided to her by her husband. Now, approximately 1 month later, again after multiple efforts to avoid testifying himself, Stuart Altman finally took the witness stand. During his testimony, Stuart, who is a licensed attorney, conceded that he had talked to his wife about her testimony while she was still on the witness stand. This conversation, he testified, and you'll hear, took place after her testimony on July 26th and before her testimony the next day, the point when her version of who she heard the information from suddenly changed. Now, Stuart testified that he told Emily, a witness, who he knew was still testifying under oath, that she had been wrong in her testimony. Stewart added that during his conversation with Emily, in the middle of that testimony, that she was concerned that her testimony about Durst being in Beverly Hills at the time Susan was murdered was going to be damaging to the case. So Stewart Altman is up there and he's testifying that my wife knew that what she had said was damaging, that it was going to hurt Bob Durst, and I told her, you're wrong. Now, Stewart testified that contrary to Emily's testimony on July 27, 2017, he made clear that he never told her that Durst had ever told him that he was in Beverly Hills at the time of Susan's murder. So the evidence is going to demonstrate that Emily's testimony, where she had said the day before, well, maybe I heard it from my husband Stewart, is going to be impeached by her own husband. The evidence is going to show that Emily did not hear that statement from Stewart. She heard it as she originally testified out of Bob Durst's mouth. Now, back on June 12, 2015, Stewart had talked to Durst while Durst was in custody in a Louisiana jail. So remember, this is about 3 months after his arrest. And this is a conversation that Stewart and Bob are having. Now, the subject of the conversation was, where was Durst at the time of Susan's murder?
Yeah, I saw it yesterday, and we went over a whole bunch of stuff. And they wanted to talk about where I was, when and how and everything in Los Angeles. And I've been putting it off and putting it off. Just because I'm uncertain and uncomfortable trying to take a position, since I keep remembering things differently, sort of. So I've never spoken to him at all about where I was, etc., in Los Angeles.
Right. I know, well, it's like 14 years ago, for God's sake.
So the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst, back in June of 2015, was still deciding where he was going to say he was. Not that he didn't know where he was, but he hadn't taken a position yet. Now, what has Bob Durst's position been over the years on whether he wrote the cadaver note? What has his position been? 2010, talking to Jarecki and Smerling.
Well, to begin with, you didn't write the cadaver note, is that what you're saying?
I didn't write the cadaver note.
Can you think of a reason why somebody might write a note like that?
I can't imagine. Can't imagine.
2012 with Jarecki.
So, I guess the question is, did you write the cadaver note?
No, I didn't write the cadaver note.
2015, when he was interviewed in the New Orleans jail.
The issue is going to be, there's kind of two choices that you have, two ways you could go. You could say, listen, I went down there, and you would have to explain why you went down there.
Yeah. I mean, I saw that, and the people's comments and the stuff like that. Somebody could have gone into the house and saw that Susan was lying there.
Right. And you agree that that did not happen. You did not drive down there and find Susan's body, even though you were not the killer.
I don't agree anything like that. I mean, that's evidentiary.
Okay, so you don't want to answer that. No. What I'm telling you is, I'm just saying, that did not happen. You agree you did not just find Susan's body and somebody else killed her.
I did not find Susan's body.
Durst has also made clear, absolutely, and without reservation, that whoever wrote the cadaver note is in fact the person who murdered Susan Berman.
You're writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written.
First of all, you agree, as you sit here today, you agree that whoever wrote that letter, they killed Susan. Agreed?
You see, I don't know that. I mean, maybe there were two people who killed Susan. It doesn't have to be one person. There could be two people. One person could go into the house to shoot Susan, and the other person could be the driver.
Okay, no, let me, just what I mean. Whether the person was the shooter or the driver, whoever wrote the note was a part of killing her.
Yes.
You agree, right?
Yes.
No question, right?
Whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death.
After many years of adamantly and repeatedly denying that he wrote the cadaver note, saying that only the killer could have written it, on December 24th, 2019, 3 months ago, Durst stipulated that he wrote the cadaver note. Now, Nick Chavin would ultimately recount in court the rest of that conversation from that dinner in Harlem in December of 2014. And this is what he said under oath while on the witness stand.
The dinner concluded, and it was then that as we got up to leave, I realized that we hadn't discussed the two things that he had mentioned, Kathy and Susan. I felt kind of weird that I didn't bring it up. We walk out the door. This is hard. We walk out the door, and on the sidewalk, I said, "You wanted to talk about Susan." And Bob said, "I had to. It was her or me. I had no choice." And then he turned to walk away, and I said, "You wanted to talk about Kathy." And he just kept walking away. Nothing more was said.
Nick Chavin said at that dinner, Bob Durst said to him, "It was her or me. I had no choice." The evidence is going to show that Mr. Durst, as he volunteered in the interview in New Orleans, that when pushed into the corner, he quoted Detective Cazalis. Mr. Durst brought it up, saying, when pushed into a corner, Bob Durst will kill. And the evidence will show that Bob Durst found himself pushed into a corner with his best friend, who was going to talk to investigators, a person that he knew had a penchant for talking, someone he knew who Susan's friends, including Steven Silverman, again, something Bob Durst quoted, "She's the last person you want to tell a secret to." Well, the evidence is going to show that when Bob Durst killed Kathy Durst, he didn't have a whole lot of choices as to who he was going to call to help him. And he called Susan Berman. It's a choice that would ultimately cost Susan her life. And it's a choice that many years later would ultimately lead to Mr. Durst's downfall. Now, the evidence at trial, we're going to show that Robert Durst is responsible, that he killed Kathy Durst, that he killed her, and that he got rid of her body. That's what we will prove. We will prove that he deliberately lied to investigators so that he could avoid responsibility for his conduct. We will show that when the reinvestigation happened, and when Susan Berman told him that, you know what, I'm going to talk to investigators, that she sealed her fate, that he drove down to Los Angeles in that Ford Explorer, that he was led into the house, that he waited for Susan to turn her back on her best friend, someone she loved and trusted, and he executed her at point blank range. The evidence is going to show that he murdered his friend Morris Black, dismembered his corpse, dumped the body parts like they were trash into Galveston Bay, and that he did that because, again, Morris Black was a connection to Kathy. When Bob Durst, the evidence will show, when Bob Durst killed Kathy, he killed Susan and Morris as well. Because once that happened, once he did that, there was no turning back. And Bob Durst, as the evidence will show, is a person who's going to protect and take care of Bob Durst. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the evidence is going to show in this case. It's been long and it's complicated because Mr. Durst has committed a lot of crimes. I will have the opportunity, we'll present our case, and we'll have the opportunity to get up here in closing and to argue what the evidence is going to show. But as we sit here right now and as you listen to the evidence, please understand and please evaluate it carefully. And again, please also, as you're listening, remember that many of the most damaging aspects of this case are going to come directly from him. A few months from now, I'll get up here and I'll ask you to finally hold him accountable for what he has done. Thank you very much for your time and attention.